It's a privilege to meet on Ghana Yata this evening, and I pay my respects to ancestors, elders, and emergent leaders of the Ghana nation. I acknowledge the enduring spiritual connection to country, to these waters and skies for Ghana peoples here today. And I extend my respect to all First Nation peoples here tonight. I'd also like to pay my respects to ancestors, elders, and First Nation communities of Lutruwita, Tasmania, as some of the conversation tonight will reflect upon the frontier wars against these peoples. Welcome to Flinders University Museum of Art, and thank you for joining us. I'm Nick Brown, Collections Curator at FUMA, and it's my absolute pleasure to be here tonight hosting this in conversation with amazing Australian contemporary artists James Tyler and Laura Wills. Thank you for joining us. And thank you for being here tonight to share insight into your practice and insight into this beautiful work. The Forgotten Wars 2 that we have on display as part of this exhibition at FUMA, New Acquisitions, New Perspectives. Just to provide a bit of background to why this work is here, FUMA purchased this series in 2019 as the outcome of a new fundraising program focused on acquiring art made by Australian First Nation peoples, specifically for teaching and learning purposes at Flinders University and across disciplines. So working with courses in medicine, psychology, nursing, creative arts, Indigenous studies, archaeology, history, politics, and so on. This program also supported the acquisition of works by Christian Thompson and his Museum of Others series, as well as Ree and their Look Who's Calling the Kettle Black series, which is behind me, and I'm sure you'll have an opportunity to look at that work later on tonight. So these works augment FUMA's permanent collection of around 8,000 works of art, and half of that collection is made by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So the Forgotten Wars too, in this context, is particularly special in that it's a collaboration between two exceptional artists of different cultural backgrounds, and the work speaks to the heart and power of truth-telling and reconciliation action. On first glance, The Forgotten Wars 2 is an intimate and very unassuming work. It's composed through really considered photography and really sensitively rendered drawing. Its gentle, muted palette, its inviting small scale, draws in the viewer mark by mark, layer by layer, and unravels time, unravels history, and maybe even plays a part in reconfiguring the memory in the mind of the viewer. This work disarms us, it disarms me every time I look at it, and as we quietly witness its documented atrocities. And whenever I look at this series, I always feel deep waves of emotion. So parts of this conversation tonight may be confronting, and you're welcome to leave at any time. And if anyone needs support, please feel that you can reach out to my colleagues, Brianna Spate, Anna Fennick, or Lachlan Murray. So we're going to enter this space gently, and let's start at the beginning. I'd like to first ask James and Laura about your individual practices so that we can see the lay of the land and how you enter this space with The Forgotten Wars 2. James, you're a multidisciplinary artist who works across such a diversity of media, from food and scent through to 19th century photographic practices, and then back around again to contemporary sound, video and installation. But I feel like essentially your work is really grounded in photography. Could you talk about that? What drew you to photography initially, how it informs your practice conceptually, and also, I guess, within the context of your multicultural heritage?
Namani, everyone. Thanks for having me. Just sort of, I started off wanting to be a war photographer and do photojournalism, and then I kind of started in the visual arts and sort of over time, I sort of got more interested in the arts aspect of photography. And then all of a sudden I was an artist. And so I spent, I don't know, all up probably about 15 years now between study and practicing as a full-time artist. But yeah, I guess like a lot of my work is still reflective of that route into journalism, sort of just historical journalism. So a lot of the photography that I do is 19th century photography, and I have an interest in 19th century history in Australia, which kind of coincides with Victoria, South Australia and Western New South Wales, where my family's come from, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous and Māori. So I've got a diverse background, that a lot of them were early colonists to those regions of like Portland in Western Vic, Adelaide and down south onto the Coorong, as well as up north to York Peninsula, as well as Broken Hill. So my family stretches around, sort of around the border of South Australia, New South Wales, Victoria. And so, you know, a lot of the histories that I'm exploring are around those spaces. And the families that colonised Victoria came from Tasmania, which is informed a little bit by this work. But yeah, a lot of my work is about trying to bring historical stories to the fore, which is, this is a good example of that. And a few times I've collaborated throughout my practice. Obviously collaboration always improves, you know, storytelling, and you bring in skills from other people. And so, yeah, I collaborated with Laura, who's an amazing drawer and illustrator.
And James, could you maybe continue to talk a bit more about how you incorporate 19th century photographic practices into your work more generally? I know that's not in this work necessarily, but...
Yeah, well, I guess it is in the tonal range. But essentially, yeah, 19th century photography, I guess, is all of those regions where my family come from were colonised around the same time as the development of photography. And so the aesthetic lends itself to like transcending people through those images and that aesthetic to that time. And it just kind of helps people sort of engage with the topics a bit easier when they're sort of, yeah, kind of visually transcended to those places. So.
And could you talk about the physicality of photography? I guess that the nature of walking, moving, hiking through country, through terrain, and at the same time navigating culture and history on foot with a camera. How does that feed into your... How is that a part of your practice?
Question. I don't know. Like I grew up in the bush, love the bush. It's great. Try to get out there every day, either walking or running. These days it's more with an iPhone, sometimes with a digital camera. But yeah, like just observations of plants, animals, you know, little bits of history, rock art, those sorts of things kind of draw me in. Love traveling, traveled most of my life. So grew up in the Kimberley as well. So like my mum moved around for work. So kind of got the travel bug. So yeah, and photography, I guess, has been a tool to document all of that. So yeah.
And I guess that's why we keep on seeing the landscape imagery time and time again in your work. And Laura, you, of course, share that with James in that often in your work there's depictions of landscape within your expanded discipline of drawing, using traditional, non-traditional methods from, you know, traditional media such as pastel, pencil, watercolour, through to working with light, digitally, site-specific work in the environment. But could you talk maybe about how in your work landscape and mapping collide, and maybe what first drew you to work with maps?
Sure. Hi, can everyone hear me okay? Thank you. So I guess when I think about my practice and the framework that I work in, at the moment, expanded is one of the words that I use, and also regenerative. So I think about the ethics of my practice, and I think about making works that are inclusive and participatory, collaborative, which we'll go into a bit more. And so when I'm thinking about where do I get my materials from, I started drawing on the insides of paper envelopes, started drawing on book pages, became atlas pages, sourcing materials from op shops. And that organically morphed into drawing onto maps. That sitting alongside being in a family that's travelled a lot. So I'm first generation Australian with English parents. And my dad is also a geologist, so maps were rolled up under the stairs. So there's a few sort of things that have made the maps be there, and then it's been a trajectory that has stuck, and now there's donations of maps. And yeah, there's lots of things about maps that you can draw into, and sometimes the maps are first and sometimes they're second or third in the way that I work with them. And yeah.
And Laura, I feel like part of your work is really about communicating a very deeply felt human connection with the environment. Could you talk about that, and maybe in connection to how you incorporate figures into your work?
Yeah. I've been thinking about how to communicate what might be a feeling, and sometimes it's tricky to say what that is. And more recently I've been comfortable to say, well, it's an unknown thing and it's a place of uncertainty, but that deep feeling is something that I feel when I'm in nature, that we feel when we're in nature, and that is something that I draw on for inspiration. And I don't know, maybe I hope to share that or bring that out or suggest ways where we can tap into that and share that type of feeling, which is sort of an abstract way of talking about. Yeah.
But also that comes out through that abstraction, and non-representation comes out visually through your work. So that makes sense. And I'm kind of also curious, if the audience doesn't mind me asking, how shelter factors into your practice. I've read that that's kind of a key aspect of your work.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm interested in what we need to be alive. And when, like, my early work was, well, what do we need physically? We need food and we need water and shelter. And those were some of my early research queries and investigations. And I have made shelter as well in installation forms, and that, and home, and just having that shelter around us. That's something that I feel and acknowledge and feel grateful for, and communicate that in work.
And we've already touched upon collaboration, which is a significant way of operating and making for both of you. Maybe, James, could you talk about how you've collaborated outside of this particular project? You know, I've seen you collaborate with artists, architects and museums. Could you talk about the nature of collaboration for you and how you use it as a tool in your practice?
Yeah, I don't know. Collaboration has kind of just happened haphazardly, I think. It's never really like, I don't know. I just am working with people that are like-minded and interested in the same things that I do. And I guess they just kind of organically happen. In this case, I reached out to Laura and was trying to get her to help me with my drawing skills. And then I was like, why am I doing this? You should be doing it.
But just before that, remember, I asked you to help out on the project that I was working on.
True.
Remember that?
Yeah. So, yeah, collaboration just happens, I think, and it's kind of like case-to-case basis. Done the shelter out there with like Uncle Lewis and Samantha Rich, and that kind of just organically happened. She was at the time working as at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, just in the education department, and was assisting me on a project. And then in Wilcannia, near Menindee, where I grew up. Anyway, we just kind of got talking about architecture and the fact that there isn't very much Indigenous architecture present in the Australian landscape, and there's little to nothing in Adelaide. Although there are pieces that reference aspects of it, there's nothing really holistic. And I think we were trying to, start off, but, you know, as we are both were, when we started out, I was probably still an emerging artist and she was an emerging architect designer. And we didn't have very much money, so we just kind of tried to make it happen. And so we did one. Our first one was actually major, and it had like a $70,000 budget to build a heart for Mona FUMA. And that was an incredible project, working with David Goff, who designed the structure, and then Sam basically made this portable structure that was 6 meters by 6 meters high, and it was based on a traditional Tasmanian Aboriginal dwelling from the west coast. And then we did one where we looked at Wiradjuri architecture, and then we did this one, which is a Ghana specific. So, which is obviously, I'm in Ghana as well, and I've studied how the houses are orientated and stuff like that for the best, direction and protection from the wind, as well as capturing the sun. And that were aspects that we put into this design over here. So that was a pretty important collaboration, because obviously I have an interest in architecture, but I don't have the means or know how to do it. And Sam, is a fantastic designer. So yeah, it was just really great.
Sure, and that definitely was a significant collaboration and production. Just to provide context, we're talking about the work outside of Yungarendi, just further down the hill here, which is a Wadley hut, kind of designed into the side of the hill with local plantings and so on, and it's a meeting place for Yungarendi staff and students and the general public. So maybe we'll get back to how you guys first collaborated and how the Forgotten Wars series began, I guess, and unfolded.
It kind of started out in the SA library with some pneumonia, I guess, is probably really where it started. So I was really sick with pneumonia for about a month or 2 months, and I was living with my gran. My gran never wanted to have the heater on. So I was and it was the middle of winter. So I went to the SA library to kill time while I felt better. And so I was just sort of hiring out this book, that book, and reading stuff about specifically Ghana stuff, but just more generally Aboriginal histories. And I just happened to be walking down one of the reference sections, and some big green books just caught my eye. They didn't have anything on the spine, so I don't know why they just I didn't normally just grab a book off the shelf, even if it was green. I was just oh, this is a huge book, what's this about? Pulled it off the shelf, and it was the parliamentary papers on the colonisation of Australia, and specifically each state. And so South Australia has all the records and correspondence with the House of Commons, and we essentially started out looking at some of the pictures that were in there, because there was actually war maps. And so the whole thing charts out, what happened to Ghana, systematically removed and put onto missions. Because and I guess this is probably why we talk mostly about South Australia and Tasmania in these bodies of works, because they're intertwined. Tasmanian history, colonial history happened haphazardly and was done based on responses in resistance by Palawa people with the incoming British Empire. And South Australia tried to do a humane version of that, which I don't know if it's possible unless you set up just trade with somebody. I think that's a nice alternative, rather than stealing somebody's land and setting up your own systems. Anyway, what's really interesting about the South Australian story is that they chart out a whole list of ways that they're going about removing Aboriginal people off land, selling the land off to wealthy settlers, and then essentially Aboriginal people get, put onto the Piltawatali mission, which was down between North Adelaide and Adelaide CBD, now on a 3-path golf course, which most people playing on it don't know anything about. But essentially then that community was then moved around to, moved to where the museum is currently, and then was moved again to Penindi in Port Lincoln. and then later Rauken and Point Pierce, and then and to smaller like parish churches around the around kind of like the mid-north of South Australia. And so some people ended up at Clare and other little smaller parish churches. But essentially there was also colonial violence. There was the Moriah massacre that happened down at the Coorong, and then there was Australia's largest massacre, the Rufus River Massacre, was orchestrated from here. They even sent Ghana people up to guide them up the river as well. So that's why you have that Haranga place on the river, which means in Ghana, the bend in the river, which isn't even the language of that land. But essentially, people like O'Halloran were involved in those massacres, and they were well documented and they were talked about in British Parliament. Anyway, going through all that, there's a section also of maps from Tasmania, and essentially there would have been maps here for things like the Rufus River Massacre. There would have been smaller little bits of things that were just covered up, like I know the overland between Sydney and Adelaide. They never really talked about the frontier violence that happened, but they got so trigger happy that by the time a year or two had passed, people started to brag in the pubs in Adelaide, and then it got out that they were killing people pretty indiscriminately on the frontier, and then Rufus River Massacre was the largest, and that happened on the overland when they were bringing sheep over. And we kind of wanted to highlight that in this, in Forgotten Wars 1, and this is 2, we took photos of South Australia in the first series, and then basically wanted to reconstruct these maps, and and some of the correspondence that was happening in these books that were written that could only really be conveyed visually through maps or depictions. And in the first one, it was more maps. This one's got a little bit more visual stuff, which you could probably talk a little bit more about the change. And then we did one about Kangaroo Island, because obviously Kangaroo Island is really influential in the colonisation of both Victoria from Tasmania. A lot of the whalers and sealers ended up at Kangaroo Island, and then later colonised places like Portland, where my family came. Some of my family actually spent some time on Kangaroo Island before heading that way. Some of the early colonists, and then and they were all linked, like they were all trading. Some of the first boats that came over were then sold to William Dutton for the whale industry. So like the proximity of all of this is and there's a really cool story. Kalungu, who was a Ghana woman who was kidnapped in the process, was taken around, and she gives a really amazing snapshot of all the colonists. Like she met all the famous colonists, every single one of them, because the colonies were so small at that time. And then I grew up with her story orally on my dad's side of the family, who's not Indigenous. So these stories are really interesting and intertwined in family history, but are hard to explain to people. And I think that's kind of where Laura comes into it.
Yeah, I think I remember going to the library with James and looking through the parliamentary papers and seeing the war maps there, and spending time trying to digest and think about how to reference them in the work. And I think at that point I might have been to James's studio and seen the photographs and talked about James's formulating some ideas about wanting to reference the maps. So referencing and gleaning bits of maps, or the ways that those early colonial maps were drawn, and overlaying them into James's photographs was the first series of 10. And then with the second series of 10, these works depict the early illustrations of the conflict between the First Nations and the settlers. And they're not specific to they're specific to Australia, not specific to Tasmania or just South Australia, with the illustrations and the research. But it was really difficult time to spend time with these illustrations and to be drawing them. There's lots of talking about history and how to approach the past and how to talk about things that are hidden, like James was talking about stories and bringing them out. And yeah, so this is one way to start talking about them too. Yeah.
And the idea of bringing the stories out is really visually evident in these works where, you know, you guys are working with really clear landscape form and then mapping codes or drawing other drawings that you're referencing, Laura, but as you merge them into one work, it's kind of in some ways non-representational, but parts of history come out through these layers. Could you talk a bit more about that process and maybe some of the practicality? So, for example, Laura, when you were drawing, were you both in the studio at the same time for parts of that, or were you working? Would you email each other? How did it kind of, in a practical sense, evolve to for you guys to create such really resolved works?
Trying to remember back to then, James.
Yeah, I think it's sort of the first series really laid the foundations for the preceding series, although like the approach is probably a bit different in the second and the third series. But in the first series, it was more of an idea of I would take the photos and then Laura, as a non-Indigenous person, would deface them with these wall maps, and I didn't really have much control over the process of that, as you know, there wasn't in the 19th century about the choice of what happened to the land. And so that one was kind of, the first series was kind of this interesting thing. And then the second one was more of like, no, we're working together as a team. Although it was pretty much just handing it over to Laura, knowing after the first series how, like how it was done. I mean, to do a second series, you have to trust somebody, So.
Yeah, it's coming across as a really trusting process, and especially with your first series where, as you say, you're almost acting out this process of colonisation by inviting Laura to deface, as you say, the landscapes of which you've made. That's kind of being really trusting of each other and putting yourselves in a really vulnerable space. Could you talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, well, I guess like the space that we're really kind of entering in is a space of education, I guess. So like we just kind of were working, although there's separate processes and there's like, the conceptual, I handed the picture over and, then Laura defaces it. But like essentially, I think at the end of the day, we both had the same objective, that like the process is to make people aware that there were wall maps and that there was orchestrated like conflict and systematic colonisation. I mean, Wakefield's a really good example of that. There's, like he's one of our main streets is named after Wakefield, who came up with systematic colonisation as a theory, and then they applied it to South Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand and so like essentially we kind of, South Australia and Tasmania are places where these had happened. In the East Coast, they sort of happened haphazardly, but they were planned as well. I remember seeing that there was where all the military garrisons were between Melbourne and Sydney on a map, which was really interesting. And like some of the referential names, I can't remember what they are off the top of my head, but they explained that there was a conflict there in just like the English wording of the town name. But yeah, essentially, I think Laura would have been, I mean, you could probably speak a bit to how the process went for you from your side, but yeah, from mine, and it was kind of like, I just sort of handed the information over that I'd found and gathered as a researcher, and then allowed Laura to interpret that and then work with the work.
Yeah, and this was the first time that I had read about the Black Wars, and yeah, I found it really difficult and horrible and harrowing and all of those things. It was hard to be in that headspace and hard to look, and it was just, there was a lot of emotion and need some more words for that heavy feeling, that feeling of unknowing and history and unfair and unjust and and anger and frustration of not knowing this before, not being taught this, not being shared this. This is from this place where we live. So it was a learning for me in that process, and then gleaning bits of illustrations and learning and reading. It was really difficult. And I think maybe halfway through, James would come through and have a look at the works and more dialogue and talking.
It's interesting in that sense when you express that frustration about the lack of education around these histories, but what you're doing through making these works is rewriting that history and in a visual language that's actually really accessible and available to the public. How does that make you feel as artists?
I think it's awesome, but I also feel like I've got 10-year-old twin boys and I'm just like, I want them to be learning this. I still feel frustrated, even though I feel really grateful to be involved in that conversation. But it's also like, hurry up, and we've got a lot more work and a lot more conversations to have.
Yeah, I think I've done a lot of like learning about Australian history because I do Unmonumental with Matt, and I've read so I do a project called Unmonumental with Matt Chun, and we do like a lesser known part of Australian history, a story, researcher, and then do consultation with Aboriginal people from those communities to see if they're accurate, as well as we do like migrant stories as well as colonial stories that just people are not aware of. And Australia's got a really interesting history, so it's a bit unfortunate that the British have covered up a lot of history, and that was done pretty strategically, even right up into the 70s. They just wouldn't give grants to writers. So even if the most important thing is we're not the first people to tell these stories. It's been known for like 50 years or longer that these things had happened, and people would breeze over them sometimes and they'd write this patriotic history, but there would be people that were trying to write these histories but then weren't getting the funding to do them. And then there's visual artists. Like I think of Julie Goff a lot specifically for Tasmania, because I had her as a mentor when I did my honours degree, and I learned a hell of a lot from her and other Palawa friends of mine who basically have been talking about this for most of their life. So I think like at the end of the day, I feel a responsibility, I guess, as an Australian first to bring these stories to the fore and just like either make them like aware to people, but also just to sort of like, I guess, decolonize or try and make a platform that, it's okay to talk about these histories as well. And so I guess, and just drawing awareness around our history. Like, these are really, really complicated stories and people died. It's, families were murdered. It's pretty horrendous. And, like they intersect many, many families, both colonists and Indigenous people. Obviously, as an Indigenous person, it's affected us the most. And I think one of the things is just creating a platform to allow doing that. And the visual arts has somewhat allowed a lot of visually orientated Aboriginal people to be able to have those voices to talk about colonisation. I, as a researcher, kind of just thought that it was interesting to find ways to visually represent stuff that was in books and make just people aware. Like, I really think that when thinking about because there's been so many conflicts across Australia, like you could not cover them all. There's been so many. But like, just seeking out those communities, because you'll find that there's experts in those communities who knows those histories. But I guess we sit in a really weird, space at the moment, but we always have, but it's probably more aware now that there's local Indigenous histories, there's local non-Indigenous histories, and they all kind of fall under this like weird umbrella of this pan-continental nation, which is really a phenomena that's come out of colonialism, European colonialism, because you wouldn't have places like the United States of America, Canada, Brazil, these vastly huge nations. I mean, Russia and China are those, but they're more expansionist opposed to far-flung colonies. But yeah, Australia is a phenomena where, you know, English, a foreign language, is spoken entirely across a nation, where there's, you know, micro nations within that, Indigenous nations with languages. And so it's like finding those balances. And so how do you tell a nation's history? You can't. It's these little local histories, but you do have to sort of make people aware that there is a ballpark narrative, without generalizing it too much, and sort of hone down on specific ones. And I guess in these projects we've tried to do that through South Australia, and then even Tasmania, and then even smaller to little Kangaroo Island or Carter-Padinga, yeah.
And when you're talking about bringing these histories into the light through the discipline of the visual arts, in particular, this series of works that we're looking at, they're so aesthetically pleasing and refined and so sensitively made and really draw you in. Is that part of the strategy with this particular work in terms of, you know, conveying that information around colonial conflict?
I'd have to ask you that because you're the one who did the drawing. I took pictures.
I think that's what worked well about it. It's a way to draw people in, like you're saying, for people to maybe be to notice or be lured in by something they might want to know more about what it is or can't quite figure it out. And then when you go up closer, you actually realise it might be weapons or conflict or something like that. So it does play on that, yeah.
And maybe, Laura, could you talk about some of the specific mapping codes or symbols that you've used in this particular series of Forgotten Wars?
I think there's some like battleground imagery, and there is still mapping imagery in some of the works. This one has a central hut with some colonisers at. I think that one was in, Tassie. Yeah, little aspects of sort of settlements and fragments of bodies and weapons. It also, what's the name of that drawing where it was a picture of what, if you do that, we'll do that, if you do that, we'll do that. What's this? Is that, do you remember that drawing? That really famous drawing that the colonisers...
The proclamation.
Yeah, it was a proclamation.
Yeah, so that's referenced in this one here, just different elements of it. Yeah, so, but also really looking at James's photographs and riffing off what's there. So really responding to the work as well as responding to a specific illustration that we've researched and chosen to highlight. Yeah, this one is references Bateman. That was Melbourne area. Yeah.
And I thought I'd mention, Jane, so when you talk about Laura kind of overlaying and even defacing your work, that it does, and the way that it's been done in some way makes me think about one of your series, Deleted Scenes. Is it Deleted Scenes from an Untouched Landscape? Where you have the black and white landscape and then parts of it blocked out with black geometric shapes. And in this way, parts of your photography is completely blocked out, but it's also actually bringing, at the same time as erasing, it's also bringing to the fore these historical events. I think that's really a really interesting process where both of those, both cutting out but also bringing information out from the environment and the history. I just wanted to ask briefly maybe what you're working on at the moment, or in particular how your work has progressed or developed or evolved after this series of collaboration with the Forgotten Wars.
Well, after this series, we did 3 large works based on Kangaroo Island. They were in colour, which was a nice contrast, something different. That was a couple of years ago now. Since then, I had a residency at the Museum of Economic Botany with Louise Flatty, and we collaborated, and that project was about threatened plants and endangered plants of South Australia, and developing sound work and participatory experiences for the public to come and engage in some of the research that we did there. And had a residency in Salamanca in Tasmania, and was doing a series of drawing works into local maps there, and also working with Jackie Saunders on a project for the museum. And one of the works there was a drawing into the voyages of Captain Cook. And the book, I laid out the whole book on the wall, and then the premise for that drawing was to erase that story, like of the words or the history that is one person's perception of what happened. So that's one of the works that happened. I think that was last year. And at the moment I'm working with an academic who's just spent the last 3 years driving around Australia taking footage of industrial agriculture, and he's coming to the point where he's disseminating his research, and I'm helping him to illustrate some of his ideas. Yeah.
Thanks, Laura. And James, what about you? What's some recent work that you're working on, or has this collaboration in particular impacted recent work?
Yeah, I guess I've always got a few projects on the burn, but yeah, I guess the research from this work did lead to me and Matt doing Unmonumental, which was another collaboration, which we're going to make a book next year, which should be good. But yeah, that's just like, I think I often think about art's a really interesting way to convey a message, and like over the course of my practice, it's just sort of been a way that I've done it, and it's like refining it and trying to communicate myself better and better, and like telling Australian histories. And in the case of the one with Unmonumental, it kind of like basically did a really good job at that, because it was just really like short, short texts. And yeah, we could talk about sum all of these stories up really short in a small amount of text, and then Matt would do this beautiful illustration. I seem to work with a lot of good illustrators.
And collaboration again.
Yeah. So that's one that's been pretty, like, me and Matt just do it out of a labour of love, because we've never really been paid for it. So we just continued to do it on Instagram and Substack, and then now a book deal. And so yeah, that one keeps on going. And then there's the PhD, which is a nightmare as PhDs go.
I hear that's common.
yeah, it is. And then I'm trying to do some new work as well, some stuff that's Ghana focused, as well as basically stuff like a few other key ideas, like rock art, like rock art being like, essentially Australia has some of the oldest rock art in the world, and some of the largest and oldest as well in expanses. But we often don't think about that and the importance of the art history potentially merging from either Africa or Australia. It's often focused around coming out of the West, and the West being Europe or the Middle East, even though that's the Middle East, and let's be clear that that's brown people. But anyway, I think what's really interesting is a lot of human evolutionary jumps that really kind of have shaped the way that our world is now, spur from things that were invented on this continent, and art is one of those that started here and moved its way out. And I want to sort of like make a work about that, and how important rock art is in Australia, often getting defaced for various different reasons. If it's just kids in areas spray painting over the top, to multinational mining companies blowing up sites because they like the rich iron ore around it. But essentially, like, there's so many examples of how Aboriginal art is being, or historical stuff that's in the landscape gets defaced and destroyed, but it's actually probably one of the oldest recorded histories that we have, because if there's an oral history that links to that, you know, it goes back to that point. So we actually have a human story that can tell us about it, and that's incredible. Like there's none of the other rock art around the world that dates to the same periods has an oral history tied to it that dates back to that, and it's continued. So there's a real importance in like Australia not just having the oldest communicated history, it's also got one of the oldest art histories, and we often use it as a, you know, it's often put as the poor cousin, you know, like Aboriginal arts exploded on the continent, but often like money and funding ends up being taken from that and then distributed to the rest of Australia. And it's like I really think that there needs to be a true value of Aboriginal art. So that's one work. And then another one's just looking at highways, you know, like South Road is a documented Ghana track with a song, you know, like there's a song in Nuttingerry for it. And essentially, like, yeah, you know the story for it because you have the song. And then there's, you know, and then the freeway going through Harndorf and stuff is an old track. One's going north are old tracks as well. And they just, you know, the colonists actually surveyed them in. That's the most amazing part about them, because they obviously took the best course until freeways came in and they cut, you know, swathes of lands with massive machines. Yeah. So essentially that's a story that I think needs to be told a little bit more or just brought to the fore. So, and ones where as a Ghana person, you know, we have a few of them documented, one from Kensington that went all the way through to the Riverland. So, and these are the old tracks, which is pretty incredible. And we just use them, and then, you know, often like the credit is given to the colonists for putting in these amazing highways through the land, when actually all they did was build across a history that already existed, which is time and time again seems to be the thing that like credit isn't given back to Aboriginal people. Yeah, I often think, you know, like the first like uniformed edge tool was designed in Northern Australia, which was like the axe. Like humans used like nap tools for so long, and then like you get the polished edge merge is about like 50,000 years ago in Northern Australia. And without that, we wouldn't have any straight line in this building. We wouldn't have any of the tools that we have today. That one point of innovation that happened in Northern Australia, we can trace from that point to now that we wouldn't have a scalpel for a surgery, you know, or you wouldn't have any of these uniformed shapes. And you don't, you know, often Aboriginal people are like, oh, look, you know, you should be grateful for what you've got. It's like, well, you should be grateful for what you got. It's like and I think there needs to be a better acknowledgement of innovation on this land and, yeah, what it's given the world, really. And so that's another one. And then one just looking at, you know, the fact that South Australia specifically has the highest extinction rate of animals. And Adelaide, which happens to also be Ghana land, is probably the worst entirely. And we often still continue colonisation, like new housing estates, forestry, mining. I mean, it still happens in and around Adelaide. There's mines that still actively happen around. You just, you know, they're just cordoned off really nice, damming of rivers. And, you know, people don't really often think about the consequences of that. You know, people are planting roses in their garden, not native plants, but that's like our environment is collapsing because people are still continuing developing areas without even thinking about considering like the consequence to the land that they're using. So, yeah, and I mean, it's like Adelaide's the best and worst example of that. Yeah. And I feel like as a Ghana person, it's a really important thing to acknowledge, you know, our active history of, you know, looking after the environment and finding a contemporary way to continue doing that. Yeah, it's important.
It sounds like you have just ongoing, critically important projects to engage with and create and make and collaborate with different practitioners of various expertise for both of you. And I really want to thank you so much for being here tonight to share so openly about your practice, your techniques and processes, the histories that you've been researching. And I want to now open up to the audience. If anyone has any questions for Laura or James, please shout out. Yes.
I guess looking at these, I'm just like drawn to the colour, which I imagine is from the maps. And then you were saying for the Kangaroo Island series, that you shifted to colour photographs, and like what reason that was for, or why black and white. Like, what does the black and white say in these ones?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do you have
I might just say the question over the mic. So the question is around the use of colour. In this one, it's quite a muted palette based on black and white photography, but the Kangaroo Island works, very large works, as well as colourful. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think I work a lot with colour in my practice, and I think I couldn't help but include a bit of colour into these works. And I can't remember. I asked. Can we please do some colour? Yeah.
So the Kangaroo Island series was for your pathway into bringing the colour out of the work with permission from James.
Yeah, but it's still harrowing stories and imagery that have been drawn into that. But those works are about the size of those big photographs behind, so they're quite large. But I would say, yeah, black and white is more James's palette. And it's a great challenge to be monochromatic. I love to be challenged, tonally and all that kind of thing. Yeah, to keep pushing it.
And James, you were talking about the black and white for you comes out of the 19th century processes. Do you want to elaborate?
Oh no, that's just where it comes from, doesn't it? They invented hand colouring as well, pretty much at the same time, and they, and then colour photography, merged in the very, very early 20th century. But it still was born out of black and white photography. But I think I just kind of like the aesthetic a little bit better. It's easy to edit.
Very practical, important things to factor in, I think, as a practitioner. Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
How did you go about prioritising this sequence, and which designs have you actually omitted from this prioritised group?
Okay, so the question just for the mic is how you prioritise the group, as in the ordering, and
which ones were left off this final presentation?
yes, and what were the edits? What didn't make it to become this final work?
Were there dots? I don't know.
I think James had 10 already decided, so he had his session with edits, but I did look in my folder yesterday of these two series, and there are
A couple of duds.
a couple of works that I have everything drawn into them just to test on the paper. There's about 3 works in there. And do you remember the first one that you did in your studio? It had
No, I don't.
permanent texture and highlighter on it, and you'd actually cut it and folded it to be like a map.
Oh yeah.
The photograph, which is interesting, to cut off a photograph and turn it back into a map. So there was different processes. Yeah, but I think the 10 when I got them had been chosen. So there was pressure to make them all work.
So are you saying that the aesthetic was actually chosen, or was it more the
Place.
So we had one with pavements.
Yep.
How did you prioritise this as being the most important subject to present in the sequence?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of yours. I chose the places. I mean, everywhere in Australia's had a level of, frontier violence, or has histories and names predating those as well. So every space is an important space with a story. So it wouldn't really matter where you swung the camera, you would still find an important place that would have an older historical cultural story, and then the removal happened everywhere, didn't it? So Essentially, yeah, no place is untouched in that sense. But so, yeah, I guess from my side of selecting the images, it's just places that, could have been a place of a battle. I'm trying to think to the first series if there was anywhere specific. I know that I have in times chose specific sites more specifically, but I don't know if I did in this series. I think it was more just places.
Yeah, and in terms of the illustrations for this series, it wasn't so much a whole story of one specific battle or place. It was more fragments from a range and a whole series of illustrations from that time that were chosen to be referenced from. Yeah.
And is that the same for you, James, where the photographs are different sites across Australia, not focused necessarily in Tassie or South Australia?
Yeah. So like it's mostly the southeast because I try to stick in the areas where like my family's has touched or I have in a connection to, and Tasmania is a place that my family's been to and I also have a personal connection to from like living there and studying there, as well as like some of the early colonists of like Launceston, Everton, other places that they were like Launceston Airport, I think, was like one of our families were the first colonists in that area. That was the land that they stole. And they neighboured people like, what's that, painter, John Glover. And John Batman was neighbours and his brother was a neighbour. And yeah, and then they knew William Dutton and Batman and all those dogs. So yeah, so like I guess in some ways, yeah, the place more generally becomes areas like South Australia. Victoria's been in my work a lot because that's important, particularly Western Victoria. Done works around Broken Hill, Menindee. They've been all important. Earlier works had parts of the Kimberley and stuff in it, ones that I've had personal connections to. Don't think anything, and New Zealand. So done a bit of work looking at my connection or not connection of my Māori ancestry to the North Island, South Island. Yeah.
And is there a last question? Hi, Kath.
I used these in my teaching a couple of years ago and I've used them again, so this is brilliant for me. But I have this memory of having to look up daguerreotype when I did the work, when I did that teaching, and I just wondered if is that relevant and could you say a bit about it?
Could you talk about the daguerreotype history and practice and how it connects to this work, if it does? Apart from black and white monochrome photography?
It doesn't specifically connect to this work, although I spoke to Julie Goff about like, early colonial photography, because like these colonies were small little outposts. Well, they are like, actually, they're not settlements, they're outposts is the technical term for them. Settlements means that people weren't there beforehand and there was people there beforehand, so they're colonial outposts. So the colonial outposts were quite small, and the daguerreotype was invented in 1836, but then kind of like there was an error in the fixing process and then they didn't really publish it, like Louis daguerreotype. He didn't finish it until 1839. Then it sort of like mostly emerged quickly in American colonies and in Europe, and then it sort of finds its way out to places like Australia and New Zealand. And then, so they're emerging around, the colonisation of Adelaide, Melbourne, which is like 1 year earlier, Portland, which is 2 years earlier than Adelaide, and then you've got like Launceston, which is a lot earlier, Hobart before that, Sydney colony. So it's like merging around this area. There's a few, I think there's some daguerreotypes maybe of King George Sound, which is now Albany in Western Australia. But yeah, like it was I think even by then it was an outdated tool, but it was just like slowly it made its way to the colonies. It's getting used in the colonies, and then it was getting superseded by wet plate and paper processes. But like essentially, yeah, the daguerreotype is an interesting process, which is just like an image made on a silver plate, and makes a mirror image, and that I was interested in it because they merge around the same times that this region of Australia was being colonised. So it became the documenter for this, but they weren't very good for landscapes, and they were mostly portraits, and the portraits that they were getting of, there are ones of Ghana people at Panindi Mission, potentially even photographed here and then ended up at Panindi Mission. There's ones of Kulin people in Melbourne, and then then there's scatterings of them. I think there might be even a few of Palawa people in Tasmania. But there's just like a few portraits that we know because they've got Aboriginal subjects in them. And there's also Noongar, pictures of Noongar people in King George Sound as well. But what's interesting about it is it's emerging at this point. There's a few things of Aboriginal people who we can go, oh yeah, they're Aboriginal. We know that because of the things that are in there and, you know, what people look like. But then the rest of them are white colonists who really are British. They're not Australian at this point, apart from a handful of like white people who were born, like William Dutton, which I don't think he ever had a picture of him, but he was a colonist that colonised Australia as someone who'd been born here as a second generation, and one of the colonists that took Western Victoria and set up Portland, the first kind of colonial outpost there. But anyway, essentially, most of those photos got sent back to England to their families, so we don't really know, unless you got something written on the back or it comes directly from a family where you know the lineage. There's not very many Australian daguerreotypes unless you spot a gum tree, and so I guess I ended up doing photography of landscape because there wasn't much of that period. And so I was just filling the gap, I guess, and putting gum trees in daguerreotypes. It was great.
I think we're going to wrap that up. Was there, I feel like I might have seen a wave of a hand. No last burning questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. And thank you again, Laura Wills and James Tyler, for your generosity in being here and sharing about your practice and the Forgotten Wars. Thank you so much. Thanks again.